And we're back in the 6th chapter of John. And this comes up after the feeding miracles. It comes up after the feeding of the 5,000, which is at the beginning of the chapter. So, again, we're in the Gospel of John, chapter 6, and we're looking at verses 56 through 71. For those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate and they died, but the one who eats this bread will live forever. He said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. When many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" But Jesus, being aware that his disciples were complaining about it, said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is useless. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But among you there are some who do not believe." For Jesus knew from the first who were the ones that did not believe, and who was the one that would betray him. And he said, "For this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father." Because of this, many of the disciples turned back and no longer went about with him. So Jesus asked the 12, "Do you also wish to go away?" Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of God." Jesus answered them, "Did I not choose you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil." He was speaking of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, for he, though one of the 12, was going to betray him. Let's break this down just a little bit this morning. Verses 56 through 59 we'll look at first and discuss a little bit. These verses, we have to remember that in John's Gospel there is no Last Supper that we're used to seeing it. So here, Jesus is more or less, we have the feet washing in John. Here is part of the feeding miracles, and it's part of this bread of life. And it's through these verses that Jesus is really opening our eyes to the idea of the communion table. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. So whoever eats me will live because of me. There's many different ways that the different scholars and commentaries have tried to discern or to decipher what Jesus is getting at here. First of all, 58 he says this is the bread that came from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate. And there he's talking about the bread in Exodus where they're eating the manna. And it's not like that bread. That bread you ate, you needed more. This bread is the bread of life, and that bread is Jesus. And so when the disciples first hear this, what is their response to that? Well, is it one of taking him literally? Some believe that they did think he was talking literally, and that is why they ultimately turned away. This is crazy talk. What are you talking about? This is cannibalism. We're not going to go there. This is craziness. Or others believe that in that time period, with different mystery religions and the pagan religions, and I believe we've talked about this before, that when they're sacrificing to altars or to idols and to other gods, they wouldn't sacrifice an entire animal. There would be a portion of the animal that was burned up, and the rest of it was consumed, either during that ritual or they might sell it. But there was a belief that once you consecrated that animal to that god or goddess, that god or goddess came into that flesh, and that flesh was part of that god or goddess. And so by consuming that flesh, you were actually consuming that god, and so that it was becoming part of you. And that is part of the way we think about this, actually. But because of that, they were looking at that and saying, well, that's pagan thinking, and that's too difficult. We can't go And plus, when we're talking about the blood, drinking the blood, that would have been something that would have made a Jewish person recoil, because to them, the blood was the source of life. But you had various different verses throughout the Old Testament telling them not to eat or drink blood. You're not to consume blood. You only eat flesh that does not have the blood in it. And in fact, that's part of the kosher slaughter process, if you've ever been involved in kosher slaughtering. In my varied background, in college, I was an animal science major, so I had meat science, and part of meat science was slaughtering animals. So I spent actually 2 semesters, I believe it was, doing a class where we were slaughtering animals, and part of that we did kosher slaughter for some of it. And you have to get the blood out, all the blood out of the meat. So that's part of it. You can't eat the blood. You can't drink the blood. So they would have recoiled in horror over this idea of consuming blood. What are you talking about? So there's various different reasons why they may or may not have recoiled in horror. And we can get caught up in that and wonder about that and worry about that. Or we can just say, okay, all right, it is what it is. Let's move on and see what's Jesus trying to tell us today. And how do we think about this? Well, the idea of consuming the communion, the bread and wine, and being part of Jesus' actual blood and body is not something that's totally forgotten in this day and age. In fact, this is the way that several other Christian denominations, one of which the Catholic Church, believe. They believe that when you consecrate those elements, that they literally become the body and the blood. And that's the way it is, and that's why you can't throw it away. You have to consume it, because you don't throw away the body of Christ. So, in that regard, I can envy sometimes the Catholic Church, because for them it goes beyond a symbolic meaning, and you can look at it and think, yeah, I am part of Christ. He resides in me. When I consume Christ, he's now part of my being. I don't, I'm a Protestant, I have been all my life. I don't believe that the elements become the literal body and blood of Christ. I think they're symbols. But symbolism can be just as powerful as literalism can be. And so, what we have to think about is that flesh, that blood, that wine, that bread, when we consume it, we understand Jesus. It's a symbolic representation of us trying to understand Jesus, and this lifelong hunger to understand Jesus and what he's trying to teach us. And a metaphor for that I ran into that I liked was a metaphor talking about it's like a book. And I asked Gail to help me find a classic that most people would have read so they could understand the metaphor. And this is A Christmas Carol, which is a classic. Most all of us have read it. And if you haven't read it, you've for sure seen the movies. You've for sure seen the various different depictions of it. But the book, when we see this book, what's it mean to you? What's a book? Okay, I can't really process this book in my life in this form. I can't use that book to influence my life. I can't learn from it. I can't look to it. I can't remember it. So the book is a metaphor for Christ. Until I open the book and I read the story and I understand the message, now I can internalize this book. Now it's here. Now it's here. And now it can influence my life, and it can affect me in ways beyond what even the author, Charles Dickens, might have even thought. It's the same way with Jesus. We can't really understand Jesus until we learn about Jesus, until we study about Jesus, until we read the gospel, until we have a relationship with him. Then we can internalize him, and he truly becomes part of us. And that, I think, is what's going on here. Go on just for a minute. I know we're running a little late, but I want to continue on here and look at the beginning in verse 60. When many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" The word there that's translated as difficult is skyros in Greek. And it means not that it's hard to understand. It means it's hard to accept. It means it's hard, it's violent, it's harsh, it's stern. It's difficult to understand, to accept. Not that it's difficult to understand, but it's difficult to accept. I can understand the laws that God gives us in the Bible. I may not want to accept them. Because each and every one of us finds ourselves at some point in time violating one or more of the things that God's telling us to do or not to do. And we really like to say, if I have to do that, that's too hard. I think I'll turn away. And you have to remember that turning away might not be a permanent turning away. It might be a momentary turning away. It might be a temporary turning away. But does that make it any better? Just because, I only turned away for a minute. You wanted me to go over it and tell that person that everything was going to work out all right. And I felt like it would be, that's too hard because I'm going to be embarrassed to go over and pat that person on the shoulder and say, everything's going to work out. That'll embarrass me. I'll feel like a fool. We talked about this a little bit in Sunday school today, actually. A lot of the things, it may not even be that it's the sin. It's the embarrassment. It's that I don't want to do that. God, that's too hard. This forgiving people stuff, for crying out loud, that's really hard. Who can accept that? This loving everyone, even though they don't love me, that's really hard. Who can accept that? I think I'm going to go now. And every time you don't love your brother, every time you don't forgive your brother, guess what you've just done? We can badmouth the disciples, and we can think, oh, what a bunch of fools. They turned away from Jesus. Whoa, good grief, what's wrong with them? But then think about your own life. Again, think about that time you don't forgive that person that wronged you. You did the same thing. You just turned away and walked away. I'm sorry to say I've done it. Doesn't make it any better. Just because misery likes company. We need to remember that the teachings of Christ are hard. They are difficult to accept. But that doesn't mean that someday we're not going to understand them completely. Someday when we get through this life, we'll understand. Just like I talk with the kids. That when your parents tell you to do something, you may not understand why. Someday we'll understand fully. Now we look through a mirror darkly. Someday we will see clearly, as Paul taught us. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this day. We thank you so much for the guidance that the Scripture gives us for our lives. We ask that you forgive us when we fall short, when we hate our neighbor, when we fail to live up to the act of forgiveness, when we want to take and say that somehow that our sin is sacred and somehow our sin is not a sin, and that other sins are terrible and we look down upon them. Let us always remember that each and every one of us falls short. We fall short when we fail to love and forgive each and every one of our brothers and sisters. We lift these prayers to you today in your love and your glory.